Hello and welcome. In this year's September special on my channel I showed you the Pro Audio Spectrum 16 sound card which I installed in my Tandy 1000 RSX computer. This sound card is quite exciting and deserves an own video, so today I would like to take a closer look at this card, talk about the advantages and disadvantages over the competition and explore if some disadvantages can be worked around somehow. But first of all, let's talk about the history. Why was the Pro Audio Spectrum such an interesting card? Today, every PC has an integrated sound chip on board, and most of us don't care and sometimes don't even know which chip it is. They all implement the same API, and for the usual consumer, there is no difference. A dedicated sound card just became a niche product. It is hard to believe, but in the end of 80s and the beginning of 90s, sound cards market was as hard fought as the GPU market today. Let's jump right into 1987, where Adlib introduced their music synthesizer card, which was very successful, and after 2 years already hundreds of PC games supported it. It became the standard. It was built around Yamaha YM3812 sound chip, also known under the name OPL2. Adlib didn't protect their idea somehow, and already in the year 1989, Creative Labs have taken the OPL2 FM solution, added a DSP for digital sound effects, and released their first Sound Blaster. They began a very aggressive business and wiped Adlib from the market. Now Sound Blaster became virtually a standard for all the PC games, and almost every DOS game released ever since had a built-in Sound Blaster support. After landing such a success, Creative relaxed a little bit and overlooked a serious competitor joining the market. MediaVision introduced their Pro Audio Spectrum in the year 1991. This card was not Sound Blaster compatible, however adopted the idea of the OPL2 usage as well, which was a quasi-standard from the Adlib times. However, MediaVision didn't just have stolen the idea from Adlib as Creative did, they developed the solution further and introduced not one OPL FM chips, as Sound Blaster and Adlib did, but two of them. Paired with stereo DACs, this card was the first one which officially could playback and record stereo sound, and that with up to 44 kHz, where the Sound Blaster could play back with up to 22 kHz and record with only 12 kHz, of course both only in mono. By that point, Sound Blaster Pro didn't exist yet, and all the DOS games supported only mono Sound Blaster. To fight that, MediaVision started to support game developers, and many games introduced exclusive Pro Audio Spectrum support. The audio quality of the MediaVision cards was outstanding compared to the notoriously noisy and cheaply made Creative products. The MediaVision engineers came from the industry for professional audio equipment, and they designed a product which should beat the shit out of the Sound Blaster. As if that was not enough, Pro Audio Spectrum was introduced for the same price of $249 as you would pay for the Sound Blaster back then. That put a lot of pressure on Creative, and they desperately tried to keep up. The first step was to reduce the Sound Blaster price drastically. In a shortest period of time, Creative engineers analyzed the Pro Audio Spectrum and released the first Sound Blaster Pro, which was basically the Sound Blaster 2, but with two OPL2 and two DSP chips for stereo FM and digital sound. The support for Creative's music system was dropped, on the other hand, to cut the costs, since almost no developers were interested in it anymore. However, all the struggles of Creative were not really successful, and the Sound Blaster Pro turned out to be a very rashly made product. Creative made a lot of mistakes, which they tried to fix desperately in probably a dozen of revisions. But despite of all the struggles, Sound Blaster was technologically not a threat for the Pro Audio Spectrum. Doesn't matter if the mono version or the Pro. But there was something where Creative had a distinct advantage over the MediaVision. They existed a long time before, long enough to convince many game developers to implement exclusive Sound Blaster support in their games. But the Pro Audio Spectrum was not Sound Blaster compatible, and so all the older games had to be updated. To fight that issue, MediaVision introduced another sound card named Thunderboard, which was basically a Sound Blaster clone without the Creative Music System feature. That card could be used standalone, but was meant to be an kind of add-on card to give the customers the needed Sound Blaster compatibility. As you can think, it was economically not reasonable for MediaVision and also not for the customers, but this added even more technological pressure on Creative and put a very important brick into the foundation of the MediaVision's next generation sound card. Regardless of the economical aspects, the game developers adopted Creative's first Sound Blaster Pro very slowly, and for some time, the Pro Audio Spectrum was the only really useful sound card if you wanted to use the PC with stereo sound. This changed first in 1992 when Creative introduced their Sound Blaster Pro 2.0 with the stereo Yamaha YMF 262 FM synthesizer, also known as OPL3. This time Creative landed again a very successful product, which was more integrated than the first Pro version, and so was cheaper in production. And even if the quality was not as good as from MediaVision due to the significantly lower price, the sound card was quickly adopted by the market. Suddenly, most of the games started to support primarily Sound Blaster Pro 2.0. The creative celebration party didn't last too long, and in 1992 MediaVision presented their 16-bit stereo sound card, the Pro Audio Spectrum 16, or short PAS16. And again, MediaVision's main goal was outstanding audio quality, which they reached easily. Creative lost this fight again hands down. Pro Audio Spectrum 16 made the switch to OPL3 as well, just as Creative did on the Sound Blaster Pro 2. And this time, MediaVision didn't make the same mistake again and integrated the Sound Blaster compatibility by reusing the Thunder chip from the previously developed Thunder board. Unfortunately, MediaVision didn't have enough time to go one step ahead to implement the Sound Blaster Pro 2 compatibility as well. Maybe they were too confident with their own stereo capabilities from Pro Audio Spectrum and thought that the game developers will continue to support their products in the games. Who knows? If you wanted to use the Pro Audio Spectrum 16 in stereo, the software had to support it explicitly. For a long time, that didn't look too bad, and a lot of very well-known games like everything from Sierra, Leisure Suit Larry, SimCity 2000, Star Wars Rebel Assault, and also later titles like Descent, Doom, and Duke Nukem 3D, they all implemented this support for MediaVision sound cards. And again, the quality of the Pro Audio Spectrum 16 was far superior to whatever Creative had at that time. At least until 1993, where Creative made a second move and introduced the Sound Blaster 16. This time they invested a lot more into the audio quality and released a sound card with decent output. But boy oh boy, they also introduced so many bugs. One of the funniest was that they messed up the compatibility to their own Sound Blaster Pro 2. Yes, this sound card could be used in stereo only if the game supported it as a Sound Blaster 16 explicitly. All the games with Sound Blaster Pro 2 support detected the card as such, but ran only in mono. That was quite awkward from Creative, since they basically destroyed one of the most important advantages over the PAS16, the compatibility to their own previous products and games. But thanks to Pro Audio Spectrum, many games already had support for 16-bit stereo sound by that time, so the adaptation to the Sound Blaster 16 didn't take too long. But there was so much more. Things like DMA clicking, which they tried to solve and introduced the hanging note bug in later revisions, and so on and so on. The Sound Blaster 16 was a disaster in point of quality. However, Creative called out a price war at MediaVision and sold by far a lot more sound cards than anyone else at that time. MediaVision, with their quality standard, couldn't play that game and started to lose the market share, despite that it was actually a company with a better product. I will come back to the history of MediaVision a bit later. I told so much about the superior quality of their sound cards. Let's finally take a closer look at it. I have this PAS16 card, which will be the reference today. First thing I would like to mention is the PCB quality. How can you distinguish an expensive high-quality product from a cheaper one? Well, one of the most important ways to improve the quality is a proper shielding. You reach that by increasing the size of the copper ground areas over the PCB. The cheaper the sound card, the less ground plane you will see on it, since more copper means more money. If you hold the card against the light, you will see it shining through the PCB everywhere except where the copper areas are. The more expensive card like Adlib Gold or this Pro Audio Spectrum 16 have multi-layer PCBs, where a ground plane is even placed inside of the PCB. As you see, almost no light is shining through this one, and this is basically one of the biggest reasons why this sound card have such a high audio quality compared to, let's say, Creative products. By the way, this sound card belongs to the group of hardware which needs -5 volts power supply. I mentioned it in the video about the Voltage Blaster project, which I made with Phil's Computer Lab a year ago. So if you also want to play around with such a Pro Audio Spectrum, pay attention that your PSU provides that voltage, or get a Voltage Blaster, for example, if it doesn't. Now let's talk about the drivers. They are just as high quality as the hardware itself. Remember, in 1993, plug and play was not yet a thing, and most of the hardware drivers left it up to the user to set up resources like IRQ and DMA. Unfortunately, that led to conflicts quite fast, and the users could spend a lot of time trying to find out what the problem is. Most of the hardware around that time still used jumpers for the settings, but this was not the case for the MediaVision products. The company was very future-oriented from the beginning and made the product software configurable. They introduced a configuration tool which tried to detect free resources automatically and allowed to select only the IRQs and DMAs, etc., which were really free. Such an auto detection was quite tricky back in the days, and in some corner cases it could end up in a system freeze. I didn't encounter any, and I tested this card on multiple systems, but I can imagine that for some users this could be quite frustrating if that happened. Anyway, in the configuration tool you can set up the resources where the Sound Blaster should be emulated, as well as MPU for one port and RQ, and enable or disable the joystick port. Every change in the settings starts an automatic test routine to check if particular DMA or IRQ is free or not.
Performing DMA test. Performing IRQ test.
If the playback of an audio sample completes successfully, the configuration tool allows to use the selected resource. If that doesn't work, the tool asks to try another value. When everything is configured, the setup tool adds a driver mvsound.sys to the configsys. The arguments are the same as what was selected in the setup tool. You can change the settings manually without the need to run the tool every time. For example, in this configuration, D stands for DMA and is set to 1, Q is RQ, S is for Sound Blaster emulation settings, 1 means enable, 220 is the base I/O address, 1 is DMA, and 5 is the IRQ to emulate. By the way, don't be surprised if you suddenly see changing settings in this video. I captured the output onto different computers, my Tandy 1000 RSX from the Septendi video on one hand and with a Pentium 3 machine on the other. I just wanted to check if the card will make any problems on a faster systems. I will come back a little bit later back to these settings, but after a reboot, the Pro Audio Spectrum 16 should be initialized and can be used. One of my favorite tools to test a sound card is the setup utility for Dissent. It supports many sound cards and works usually quite reliably. Let's try the auto detection. And as you see, it detects already the Pro Audio Spectrum 16.
7, 7, 7.
And as you hear, it works completely in stereo. I also can select Sound Blaster as an option, but Sound Blaster Pro would remain silent, since the Pro Audio Spectrum emulates only the first Sound Blaster version, at least for the digital part, but the FM is done on this card by the same YMF262 chip, also known as OPL3, which can be found on the Sound Blaster Pro.
7, 7, 7.
This is actually the first disadvantage of the Pro Audio Spectrum. It can emulate only mono digital sound of the Sound Blaster, but stereo FM sound of the Sound Blaster Pro. If you want to use this card in full stereo for digital and FM, then you have to use it as the Pro Audio Spectrum 16 and forget about the Sound Blaster emulation. The good news is that at the time where Sound Blaster Pro hit the market, the Pro Audio Spectrum was already widely used and was implemented in the most games natively, so you didn't need the Sound Blaster Pro compatibility. But where it is light, there is always a shadow. I would like to remind you that this card, which I have here in my hands, is a Pro Audio Spectrum 16, which came out after the Sound Blaster and the Pro Audio Spectrum. As I said before, thanks to the Thunder chip, It is Sound Blaster compatible, but what about the first Pro Audio Spectrum? Unlike the PAS16 with its stereo OPL3 chip, the first Pro Audio Spectrum used a pair of OPL2 FM synthesizers to obtain its stereo capabilities, but OPL3 is only backwards compatible to one OPL2 chip and not a pair of them. What does this mean for the PAS16 compatibility to its predecessor? Well, in short, Pro Audio Spectrum 16 was mostly compatible and could be used as Pro Audio Spectrum in the games which supported it. However, with one limitation. Digital sound was completely backwards compatible, but FM could be played only in mono, since the OPL3 could emulate only one OPL2 but not two of them. Take a look at Blackthorn. This game supports PAS and PAS16. Hear how it sounds with PAS16. But if I set up PAS, the FM sound is only mono. Continuing the compatibility topic, what about the ADPCM codec support? One of the most famous games which used that codec was Duke Nukem 2. As you hear, we are getting digital sound with ADPCM codec as well, so PAS16 with its Thunder chip is really completely Sound Blaster compatible. I tested many games from the early days of the Sound Blaster, but also some newer titles, and I didn't notice any issues. All games just worked either as Sound Blaster emulation or explicitly as Pro Audio Spectrum. I also didn't hear any DMA clicking, which was notorious for Sound Blaster products. Prince of Persia is a good title to test for it. If there would be a DMA issue, you could clearly hear the clicks between the step sound, not with the Pro Audio Spectrum 16. The only one serious compatibility issue I heard of is a poor MPU 401 implementation. As far as I heard, it doesn't work properly in many games and also has a hanging node bug. Unfortunately, I currently have no external hardware to validate these issues, but you should keep it in mind in case you want to use this card with some external synthesizer. The Pro Audio Spectrum 16 line was marketed under a couple of different names. The hardware difference was usually only about the CD-ROM interface. There were cards with SCSI or proprietary interfaces, or with no CD-ROM interface at all. Otherwise, the most of the cards were distinguished only by software. So let's take a look at what we have. I already mentioned the outstanding setup utility. There were also a couple of players for MIDI and digital samples. For example, the Track Blaster Pro Audio Tracker. As I told, unlike Sound Blaster, the Pro Audio Spectrum was a semi-professional hardware, which you could also use for gaming. But there were a lot of different applications for professional usage, composition and recording as well. I can't cover all of that today, maybe another time, but today I will stay at the consumer level and would like to mention the outstanding mixer software. The mixer utility is called PAS. If you call it without the parameters, it will show the detailed help with options and examples. The tool works with commands which you simply have to concatenate. Basically, it has two commands, get and set to, well, get and set the settings. If you simply write PAS get, you will get the current volumes overview. If you write pass get volume, you will see only the master volume. If you want to set master volume to 50%, you have to write pass set volume to 50. You can also set just the FM volume by using pass set FM to 50. You also can control left and right channels separately and set only the left channel to 100%, for example. The cool thing is that you can use these commands in a batch file, but I know that a console looks clumsy for many people. That's why you can use pass star to get into a graphical user interface where you can set up all the levels using your arrow keys in the keyboard. Using Shift F5, Shift F6, and etc., you can save the profile and load it again by just pressing F5 or F6 and so on. Back on the console, you can use, for example, pass F5 to load the profile. You can add this line to the AutoExec pad to restore the volume level during the boot. To be able to use all the MediaVision software, you need the mvsound.sys driver to be loaded in memory. And this is another disadvantage of the sound card. Take a look at the memory usage. MV Sound takes more than 11 kilobyte of conventional memory. That is quite a lot, especially compared to the Sound Blaster, which doesn't need any drivers at all. One way to work around this is to enable EMS memory and move the driver from the conventional memory using device high command instead of device in the config Cs. However, this could be a problem in some cases, since there was a lot of older software which was allergic against EMS, so what can be done? Well, I rebooted the system now without the driver mvsound.sys. As you can see, MEM doesn't report it and we have amazing 627 kilobytes of free conventional memory. As you see, Wolfenstein 3D doesn't detect any Sound Blaster in the system without the driver. The PAS16 software also contains a utility which activates only the Thunder chip for the Sound Blaster emulation without activating the full Pro Audio Spectrum features. This utility is called proas.exe and can be used with the same arguments as were used in the config Cs to load the mvsound.sys. I put the command with the arguments into a batch file as a shortcut, so I don't need to write all the arguments every time. As you see, the utility reports that we should have the Sound Blaster emulation now active. The good thing is that the utility doesn't take up any memory. It just activates the hardware and exits without a footprint. We still have free 627K of conventional memory. And now Wolfenstein 3D detects Sound Blaster and we definitely hear some sound. As I said, the proas.exe command can be placed into a batch file to simplify the execution. So the good thing is it will give you the Sound Blaster compatibility at no memory costs. But on the other hand, it would also mean that the most MediaVision software will not run, complaining that the driver is missing. This includes not only the tracker software, but unfortunately also the mixer. Furthermore, the games will not detect the sound card as the Pro Audio Spectrum 16 anymore, but only as a Sound Blaster. Here is Descent as an example. Eventually, you have to decide if you need the full Pro Audio Spectrum features, but less memory, or you use EMS with the driver loaded into the higher memory, or the Sound Blaster compatibility only with no additional memory usage at all. Maybe it is useful to make a boot menu where you can prepare different configurations dependent on the requirements. During the making of this video, I played quite a lot of games, and I have to admit that the sound quality amazed me sometimes, really. Even if the OPL3 chip is the same on both Creative and MediaVision products, on the PAS16 it sounds more substantial. I guess this has something to do with a better preamp circuits, but it is just a guess. I hope I could explain why the sound card was the best you could get on the market back then. Creative couldn't compete with MediaVision quality-wise, so they made their products good enough, and established the real competition around the price. MediaVision was not ready to sacrifice the quality and started to lose positions. They also made a very successful Jazz 16 chip, which was integrated on various high-quality sound cards by another manufacturers. These cards were usually just as good in quality as their Pro Audio Spectrum predecessors, but they were not backwards compatible to pass anymore. It was more or less a high-quality Sound Blaster 16 replacement. Unfortunately, after a while, MediaVision got into bigger economical problems and was pulled into a financial scandal. That didn't end well for the company. Eventually, it was split and sold. Creative won that battle in the end, but we shouldn't forget the legacy of the Pro Audio Spectrum. The sound card learned Creative to fear and pushed the technological progress in PC audio dramatically. The Sound Blaster was never the better product. The Pro Audio Spectrum was far superior, but just as always, it is the price which decides over life and death of a company, and in the end we got not the best, but something what is good enough. And thanks to Pro Audio Spectrum, this good enough ended up eventually even far better than it could have been. One question remains: what happened to the rest of MediaVision? Well, all the names, trademarks and product lines were sold, but the company and the people around it joined again under another name. Yes, the Oriole, which stands behind the A3D audio technology and some really great PCI audio sound cards. And again, MediaVision, now under the name Oriole, stood face to face with Creative. A3D versus EAX, a fight for the better 3D audio standard. But this is a story for another day. And I hope you enjoyed this brief review about the sound card's history. I would be glad to see you on my channel again. Please leave your feedback below, subscribe, share my channel, and so forth. Thank you and goodbye.